Well, good evening. I'm Rick Caulfield. I'm the new provost or chief academic officer here at the University of Alaska Southeast, and on behalf of Chancellor Pugh and the faculty and the staff and the students here at University of Alaska Southeast, I'd like to welcome all of you to Evening at Egan. I moved to Juneau with my wife here just about 3 months ago, 2.5 months ago, and always enjoyed watching Evening at Egan on television, on statewide television. So I'll give a greeting to all those who will be watching it streaming live tonight or actually watching it recorded at a later date on television. And we always enjoyed the speakers who were available here at Evening at Egan. And before I get into a little more about introductions, I just want to draw your attention to the upcoming events that we have Evening at Egan. Our next session on October 15th will be a session on Mahler, Modernism, and Resurrection with Kyle Pickett, who many of you know from the Juneau Symphony. On October 22nd, a presentation by Heather Lindy, also a well-known Southeast author, on family, friends, and faith in small-town Alaska. And on the 29th, we have Professor Clive Thomas, who will be talking about the Sarah Palin phenomenon, an Alaska, national, and international perspective. I know we'll all enjoy hearing Clive's perspective on that. In thinking about the theme for this amazing array of presenters we've got tonight, tomorrow, and Sunday here at UAS, the focus of this is peace, justice, and reconciliation, and it's a partnership between the University of Alaska Southeast and the Juneau World Affairs Council. And I was thinking about the ways, big and small, that we can all have a part in promoting peace, justice, and reconciliation, and it made me think of, in my own family situation, we actually sponsored a young man, a high school student from Cairo, Egypt, a few years ago, living with our family in Fairbanks, and it was quite an interesting experience having him arrive during the month of Ramadan and figuring out how we would deal with his needs. And the first thing we had to do was find out which direction Mecca is located. So I opened up my laptop and we started up Google Earth, and he had never seen that before, so it was pretty exciting for him to learn that you could check out the location of Mecca using Google Earth, and lo and behold, the shortest distance from Alaska to Mecca is actually right through the North Pole. So we had a good opportunity to talk about geography with our young friend from Cairo. And then he ended up going to high school in Fairbanks, and interestingly enough, he actually experienced at the beginning some sort of unkind words, misperceptions from fellow students, and we were a little bit concerned about that on the front end. But over time, he became a very good friend of many high school students in Fairbanks, to the point where he'd be out on the soccer field, and his name was Muhammad, and so people would say, "Hey, Muhammad," or we'd be walking through Fred Meyer's, where else, and people would shout up and down the hall, "Hey, Muhammad, how are you doing?" And when I think about peace and justice and reconciliation, I think it's actually a good thing that there are high school students in Alaska who have a friend named Muhammad. So with that sort of in mind, I would like to just take a moment to thank a number of people who helped put this event together tonight, and that includes board members with the Juneau World Affairs Council, Jocelyn Clark, Jeff Nass, Hildegard Sellner, and Dave Sturdivant, and also the support from the Juneau People for Peace and Justice, Don Gottschall, Judy Mayer, Rich Moniak, KJ Metcalf, and Bob and Elaine Schroeder. And a special thanks as well to Alaska Airlines, DreamHost.com, Heritage Coffee, and Amy Carroll for their support in helping put this event on. So with that, I'll turn it over to my old friend Bob Schroeder.
Thank you, Rick. I think we have a really wonderful program that's commencing this evening with our two speakers, Erica Chenoweth and Julie Mertus. Elaine and I have just been having a really great time getting to know both of them. They're staying with us, as well as our Eric is not staying with us. Thank you. We've had a great time getting to know the speakers who are staying with us, and my wife can correct me at any time. We do have a really good program this weekend, and we have two speakers this evening. The speakers will speak sequentially, and we'll hold questions until they're done with their talks. Tomorrow our program begins at 10 and goes to 5. We'll have two speakers. We'll have panels tomorrow, as well as a breakout group where people can meet more intimately with some of our presenters and have some discussion. Tomorrow evening, there's a special event, workshop held at from 7 to 8:30, not 9:30 as misprint on here, which will be led by Judith Thompson, and that will also be on campus here, so we urge you to attend that. And let's see, the other logistic sorts of things, sometimes it's hard to find a place to eat on campus over the weekend, but you can stay around because the cafeteria is staying open for us. So I don't want to take a whole lot of time because that would be less time for our speakers, so I'd like to turn over our introduction to Linda.
Thank you, Bob. And Bob was going to mention that there are membership cards out in the lobby, and I'm going to mention that right now. If you're not a member of JWAC, please fill out a membership card and join us. It's only $25 for an annual membership, and it's a really good group. We have a lot of fun and enjoy bringing these kinds of speakers to Juneau that you're going to hear tonight and over the weekend. I'm going to be introducing Erica Chenoweth. And in addition to what you have read in the paper, maybe heard on the radio interview, or what you see in your program, I learned that Erica comes from a family of opera musicians. But instead of becoming an opera musician while she was going to college in Dayton, it just happened that it coincided with the Dayton Peace Accord, and she had the opportunity to be a driver for the folks who were there, and it really piqued her interest, if it wasn't piqued already, in peace and reconciliation and these kinds of things, and planted a seed. And so she sort of diverted from what might have been a career in kind of classical music and opera, following along with her other family, and ended up doing extensive research on nonviolent conflict. Erica splits her time between Middletown, Connecticut, and Oakland, California. So where a lot of us go south and north, she spends a lot of time going east and west, which I kind of can't get my head around because of the time zone thing. At least when you go north and south, there's not that big time zone difference to deal with. But we're really, really happy that that Erica is here with us and that she had a chance to enjoy the beautiful weather the last couple of days and actually get out and do some fishing, which is also a passion that she has. And I am going to take the honor for the university on behalf of the Chancellor's Office to present you with a water bottle, and we have one of these for each of the speakers. And I'm going to hand this over to Erica and hand the mic over to her as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, everybody, for coming. And I also want to thank Bob and Elaine Schroeder for asking me to come. And I want to thank Dave Sturdivant and Sue Baxter for doing more than just accommodating me, but giving me a real great feel for Juneau and taking me fly fishing and taking me hiking and everything else. Really appreciate it. And I'm actually always really humbled when I'm asked to speak about my research because, you know, it's kind of a humbling thing to do research like this and then to have people actually want to hear about it. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity as always, and thanks to all of you for coming. So today I'm going to talk with you about some of my research that my co-author Maria Steffen and I recently completed. Our research is on the outcomes of nonviolent and violent insurgencies. These are terms I'm going to explain in a few moments. But first I want to tell you a little bit about how I got started out on this project in the first place. So in the summer of 2006, I was a graduate student at the University of Colorado, and I was about to complete my thesis on why terrorist groups emerge in democracies more often than in authoritarian regimes. And a colleague of mine sent me an email announcement of a pedagogical workshop on people power movements that was being held in Colorado College in June of 2006. The workshop was sponsored by this private corporation called the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which is a private foundation that's devoted to the study and spread of information about strategic nonviolent resistance. So I attended this workshop as a total skeptic because I'm, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm not a pacifist, and I think violence has its uses from time to time. And I have a background in security studies. I've spent most of my time trying to get into the minds of terrorists, insurgents, and repressive political leaders to try to find out what compels them to kill other people for various political goals, which are sometimes very bizarre political goals and are other times very mundane goals. And I've spent hours upon hours reading through memoirs of terrorists, developing statistical models to forecast terrorist events, tracking down government officials here and abroad to talk about how to find better government responses to terrorism, surveying radical groups over the internet, attempting to make sense of wartime atrocities, mass rape, and genocide. So as you might imagine, I found myself highly skeptical of anyone that wanted me to incorporate literature on nonviolent resistance into my classroom. But nevertheless, I tried to keep an open mind. And in preparation for the workshop, the organizers asked me to read about 24 books and articles on strategic nonviolent conflict. I was stunned that I had never heard of a single one of the authors who was assigned, despite the fact that the field was evidently very well established. The literature was completely foreign to me, even though many of the dynamics, like mobilization, opponent provocation, etc., were quite well developed in theories of violent conflict as well. I realized that there was an entire body of work, much produced by activists and a few key theorists like Gene Sharp, that had not been incorporated at all into the security studies canon. I mentioned this to the sponsors of the workshop and offered them several observations. First, political scientists had not yet systematically studied the relative effectiveness of nonviolent and violent resistance over time and space. In particular, the activist literature would not be compelling to many social scientists, whose main method of advancing knowledge is hypothesis testing. Second, such a study would be necessary if they wanted security studies scholars to take the strategic nonviolent conflict literature seriously. So a few research proposals later, I had embarked on a new project with the goal of systematically assessing the relative effectiveness of nonviolent and violent resistance campaigns. Today's talk represents the culmination of this research, which is now forthcoming with Columbia University Press. The book is going to be called Why Civil Resistance Works: The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. I can't discuss the entire book in a single talk this evening, but I'd like to convey tonight 3 main ideas based on this research. First, nonviolent mass resistance has had a superior track record in producing regime change and expelling foreign occupations when compared with violent resistance. Second, this trend holds even in environments in which we might expect nonviolent resistance to be futile, such as in very repressive or authoritarian regimes. Third, the structures of different resistance campaigns tend to reproduce themselves after the conflict ends, such that societies emerging from nonviolent campaigns are much more likely to be democratic and to avoid civil wars than ones emerging from violent campaigns, which are more likely to be authoritarian and experience relapse into civil war. I will also offer my best guess as to why these trends hold, drawing upon evidence from over 300 cases of violent and nonviolent resistance between 1900 and 2006, as well as theoretical insights from political science and political psychology. We argue that the source of the success of nonviolent resistance is the power of participation, which can produce divisions within the opponent regime when the resistance includes diverse sectors of society that maintain nonviolent methods of resistance. Domestic mobilization is a more reliable source of strength than, say, the sponsorship of an outside state, which can be fickle and constraining. The implications of these findings are profound and provide a critique of several conventional wisdoms. In particular, in various political science works, one often sees the following assumptions. First, insurgents use violence because it is effective, and it is a last resort, something they are forced to choose after having exhausted all other political means. Second, nonviolent resistance is ineffective against brutal regimes, is ineffective for achieving tough demands, and only emerges in contexts where it is likely to succeed in the first place. Before I get into the substantive information, I'd like to first outline the scope of this project. First, let me tell you what we're not doing. We are not attempting to explain why certain types of campaigns emerge. So we're not trying to explain why nonviolent resistance emerges sometimes and violent resistance emerges other times. We are also not trying to examine all types of resistance campaigns, such as anti-war movements or environmental movements or peace movements. Personally, I do not argue that nonviolent campaigns are always morally superior to violent campaigns or that the good guys always win. Nonviolent campaigns do not succeed just because they have the moral high ground. Many have failed, and violent insurgencies sometimes succeed. Also, we are not attempting to establish a formula for campaign success, and we are not going to focus on the human experience of conflict. In fact, most of the results I will discuss today are statistical in nature, with a few illustrative anecdotes sprinkled in. Now let me tell you what I'm going to do tonight with you and what we're trying to do with this project. Our goals are to assess the empirical accuracy of the conventional wisdoms I mentioned, to compare trends in the outcomes of nonviolent and violent campaigns, to locate the conditions or mechanisms under which campaigns succeed and fail, and to make some claims about the strategic utility of different approaches to achieving power. Let me describe the data I've collected and define a few key terms that I'll be using frequently throughout the talk. What I did for this study was to identify the major nonviolent and violent resistance campaigns between 1900 and 2006 that sought two hard or difficult types of goals: regime change or territorial change. The latter refers to anti-occupation or secession movements. I use the terms nonviolent resistance and civil resistance interchangeably. A nonviolent campaign is one in which unarmed civilians prosecute the conflict, relying on tactics such as strikes, protests, sit-ins, go-slows, stay-aways, rallies, and other forms of mass collective action, short of physically harming or threatening to physically harm people or property. Examples include the 1986 People Power movement in the Philippines, the 2000 anti-Milosevic resistance in Serbia, and the East Timorese independence movement, among many others. Conversely, a violent campaign is one in which the primary method of resistance involves the use of arms to physically threaten or harm people and property. I use the terms violent resistance and insurgency interchangeably. Many times when people hear the word nonviolent, they think of passive resistance, which obscures the very active role that civilians play in the prosecution of the conflict. Others think of principled nonviolence, which refers to a moral or spiritual decision to avoid the use of violence. In my case, nonviolent is simply a descriptive term, meant to more easily distinguish between the use of violent tactics and the use of civil resistance tactics. In most of the cases that I'm going to discuss tonight, nonviolent resistance was used strategically, as it was thought to be the most effective way to wage a struggle. Indeed, in many cases, activist leaders displayed few moral objections to using violence, but rather viewed it as risky in terms of recruitment and counterproductive in terms of their overall aims. Admittedly, there are many difficulties with labeling one campaign as violent and the other as nonviolent. In many cases, both nonviolent and violent campaigns exist simultaneously among different competing groups, as with Palestinian movements. Alternatively, some groups use both nonviolent and violent resistance over the course of their existence, such as the African National Congress in South Africa. So characterizing a campaign as nonviolent or violent is oversimplifying a very complex constellation of resistance methods. But what we are interested in here are ideal types, nonviolent and violent, to show theoretically how these poles operate differently. And such an exercise would just be academic, except that we do observe campaigns that are primarily focused on these particular resistance methods throughout the 20th century. These ideal types are what interests me the most for the purpose of this study. I define a campaign as a series of continuous mass events in pursuit of a political objective. A campaign can last anywhere from 3 days to 60 years. Campaigns have discernible leadership and often have names, distinguishing them from random riots or spontaneous mass acts. Other scholars often use campaigns as their unit of analysis, such as Robert Pape's analysis of suicide bombing campaigns, or Horowitz and Reiter's analysis of aerial bombing campaigns. In such studies, campaigns usually have distinguishable beginning and end points, as well as discernible events throughout the campaign. My selection of campaigns and their beginning and end dates is based on consensus data produced by multiple sources. Success. How do we define success? In this study, I identify it as a dichotomous variable of whether the movement achieved 100% of its stated goals within a year of the peak of its activities. Ongoing movements are coded as failures through 2006. I incorporated data from multiple sources to measure different control variables, such as the regime type, government capabilities, and military power, and population size, which may affect the ability of a campaign to succeed. To estimate the effects of these and other variables on campaign outcomes, I employed logistic regressions followed by post-estimation procedures that are typical in the social sciences, but I'm going to spare you any discussion of coefficients or p-values, and instead will focus solely on presenting the substantive findings from these models. Let's look at the trends and the outcomes of nonviolent and violent resistance campaigns. As you can see from Figure 1, nonviolent campaigns are more than twice as likely to succeed compared with violent campaigns. Figure 2 shows that the trend of successful nonviolent campaigns is increasing over time, such that in the past 10 years, over 60% of nonviolent campaigns have succeeded. These trends are puzzling, given the conventional wisdom. How can we explain the strategic superiority of nonviolent resistance? We argue that essentially nonviolent campaigns have a greater capacity for mobilization than violent campaigns, leading to a wider and more diverse base of participants. This ability to mobilize supporters while eschewing the use of violence against the opponent sows divisions within the regime, thus removing the regime from its main sources of power. I define participation in a resistance campaign as the active and observable cooperation of individuals in collective action. So when measuring campaign participation, I used estimated counts of observed individuals. Instead of constructing cumulative counts, which would be nearly impossible, I counted the maximum number of estimated participants that participated in peak events in the campaign. For example, if a resistance campaign holds mass protests in September with 12,000 people, November with 24,000 people, and December with 20,000 people, I would use that November figure of the 24,000 for my estimate. So I code that particular campaign as having 24,000 maximum participants. I similarly code the estimates of both guerrilla and civilians to generate figures about the levels of participation in violent insurgencies. Now let me tell you why we expected to see that nonviolent campaigns would be more likely to attract a larger number of participants than violent campaigns. We argue that nonviolent campaigns possess fewer physical, informational, moral, and commitment barriers than do violent campaigns. So first, let me talk about the physical barriers. Active participation in a resistance campaign requires variable levels of physical activity. The physical risks and costs of participation in a violent insurgency may be prohibitively high for many potential members. While certain of these physical skills, including endurance, willingness to sacrifice, and training, can also be applicable to participation in nonviolent movements, the typical guerrilla regimen may appeal to only a small proportion of any given population. Physical barriers to participation may be lower for nonviolent resistance, since the menu of tactics and activities available to nonviolent activists is broad and includes a wide spectrum ranging from high-risk confrontational tactics to low-risk discrete tactics. Generally, participation in labor strikes, consumer boycotts, lockdowns, and sit-ins does not require strength, agility, or youth. Participation in a nonviolent campaign is open to female and elderly populations, where participation in a violent insurgency is often, though not always, physically prohibitive for these groups. Although female operatives, even female suicide bombers, have sometimes been active in violent campaigns in Sri Lanka, Iraq, Pakistan, Palestine, and El Salvador, they are definitely the exceptions in most of these cases. So let me now talk about the informational difficulties. Scholars have found that individuals are more likely to engage in protest activity when they expect large numbers of people to participate. To successfully recruit members, campaigns have to publicize their activities to demonstrate their goals, abilities, and existing numbers to potential recruits. Because of the high risks associated with insurgency, movement activists may be limited in how much information they can provide. They may need to remain underground, thereby exacerbating informational problems. Although violent acts include assassinations, ambushes, bombings, and kidnappings are public and often attract significant media attention that provide signals of the campaign's abilities, the majority of the campaign's operational realities, including information about the numbers of active participants, often remain unseen and unknown. The absence of visible signs of opposition strength is therefore problematic from the perspective of recruitment. So violent resistance is at a disadvantage in this regard, since the actual number of pre-existing activists is not explicit. Nonviolent public tactics have important demonstration effects, which help address this informational problem. Although nonviolent campaigns sometimes include clandestine activities, such as the use of underground publications during the Polish Solidarity struggle, they typically rely less on underground activities than armed struggles. When communities observe open mass support and collective acts of defiance, their perceptions of risk decline, reducing constraints on participation. This contention is supported by critical mass theories of collective action, which contend that protesters base their perceptions of protest opportunities on existing patterns of opposition activity. Let me move on to the lack of moral barriers. Moral constraints sometimes inhibit participation in nonviolent resistance, far less than participation in violent insurgency. Although an individual's decision to resist the status quo may follow a certain amount of moral introspection, taking up weapons and killing adds a new moral dimension. Unwillingness to commit violent acts or to support armed groups necessarily disqualifies segments of the population that sympathize with the resistance but are reluctant to translate that sympathy into action. For violent resistance campaigns, the leadership may need to rely just on the proportion of the population that is willing to use violence against the adversary and its supporters, while settling for sympathy and passive support from the rest of the population. But nonviolent resistance campaigns can potentially mobilize the entire aggrieved population without facing these moral constraints. In the words of James DiNardo, joining a nonviolent resistance campaign against a powerful adversary, quote, requires less soul-searching than joining a violent one. Violent methods raise troublesome questions about whether the ends justify the means and generally force the people who use them to take substantial risks, end quote. So finally, commitment problems. Whereas violent campaigns attract people with high risk tolerance, nonviolent resistance campaigns may offer an opportunity to participate to people with varying levels of commitment and risk tolerance for four principal reasons. First, the new recruit to a violent campaign may require more training than a recruit to a nonviolent campaign, creating a lag between volunteering and participation. This lag and the strenuous requirements for insurgency may reduce the number of people that join the violent campaign on a whim. Second, violent campaigns typically enforce higher levels of commitment at the outset. Screening potential participants is much more intense in violent movements. Often, new recruits to violent movements must undertake a violent act to demonstrate their commitment. This is a further inhibition to participation in armed struggle, because potential recruits may wish to eschew drastic screening processes, or movement leaders may find it hard to trust these new recruits. Third, during the prosecution of the conflict, participants in nonviolent campaigns can return to their day jobs. They can return to their daily lives and their families with lower risk than participants in violent campaigns. Compared to armed struggle, nonviolent resistors can more easily retain anonymity, which means that they can often participate in acts of resistance without making major life sacrifices. This is particularly true when a campaign uses nonviolent methods of dispersion, such as stay-at-home strikes or consumer boycotts, in which cooperation is withdrawn without leaving the state with a tangible target for repression. The commitment required by people who join violent campaigns often prevents them from resuming their lives during or after the conflict, and they are more likely to go underground to evade state security. Finally, nonviolent resistance offers a greater repertoire of low-risk actions. Although nonviolent struggle is rarely casualty-free, the price of participating and being caught in armed struggle is often death. On the other hand, the wearing of opposition insignia, the coordinated banging of pots and pans and honking of horns, the creation of underground schools, and the refusal to obey regime orders are a few examples of less risky nonviolent tactics that have been used by groups around the world. So the arguments I've made suggest that nonviolent campaigns will be more successful at generating large bases of participants. In fact, participation figures on the campaigns in my data set suggest that nonviolent campaigns are associated with higher membership than violent campaigns. They tend to be nearly twice as large as violent campaigns, with average participants numbering well above 200,000. When large numbers of people in key sectors of society stop obeying and engage in prolonged acts of social, political, and economic disruption, they may fundamentally alter the relationship between ruler and ruled. We find, in fact, that campaign membership has a statistically significant effect on the probability of success. The smallest groups, with scarcely more than 1,000 participants, have had very poor odds indeed compared with groups with hundreds of thousands or millions of participants. The Iranian Revolution of the late 1970s is an illustration of this. Although violent insurgencies, such as the Fedayeen and Mujahideen, had resisted the Shah since the 1960s, they were only able to attract several thousand followers. Pahlavi's regime crushed the armed groups before they produced any meaningful change in the regime. The nonviolent revolution that emerged in 1977, however, attracted several million participants who engaged in boycotts, protests, stayaways, and sit-ins until the regime fell. Membership is important, but it is also insufficient. Many campaigns mobilize huge numbers, but never achieve their aims. Some enormous campaigns, like the anti-communist campaigns in East Germany in the 1950s, which boasted about 400,000 participants, and the anti-Japanese insurgency in China during the 1930s and 40s, with over 5 million participants, failed utterly. Some campaigns, conversely, will mobilize far fewer members, but nevertheless succeed. This is because the quality of the participation is just as important as its quantity. Sheer mass cannot substitute for strategy and resistance. In particular, successful campaigns tend to be able to divide the regime from its main sources of power, in particular, the security forces. Strikingly, I've found that loyalty shifts within the security forces increase the chances of campaign success by over 60%. But we find that security forces tend to defect much more often when they face nonviolent campaigns, particularly as the numbers rise. Controlling for other factors, security forces are about 60% likely to occur with the largest nonviolent campaigns with 4 million participants. On the other hand, security force defections are over 30% likely with average-sized nonviolent campaigns. But violent campaigns never obtain up to 40% probability of achieving security force defections. In fact, the average violent insurgency has a probability of between 10 and 30% of producing a security force defection. The reason is that with a large number of nonviolent participants, the chances for kinship ties or other social networks that link members of the elite to the larger civilian population increase. The importance of even loose ties between regime elites and resistance activists was illustrated by Srđa Popović, who was a member of the student group Otpor in Serbia. Popović made the following observations regarding the relationship between Milosevic's police and the nonviolent resistance movement that was pressuring the regime to stand down following stolen elections in 2000. Here's what he said, quote, "We were producing the sympathy in the wider audience. It was quite normal to produce in people who are parents because they can recognize their own children in Haute-Port activists. But as for the police, we tried 3 times to approach them, and the 3rd time it was useful. First time we developed a message. Our message was, there is no war between police and us. Somebody else is misusing police against the students, and it's abnormal. There is no reason for the police to fight against the future of this country, and we were repeating that and repeating that in our public actions." End quote. Popovich's mention of members of the regime as parents of some of the Haute-Port activists underscores the importance of wide networks that link members of society to members of the regime itself. As Annika Binnendijk has shown, the larger the resistance, the more likely such networks do exist, with meaningful links between the regime and the resistance. The defection of security forces occurred within the ranks of the Iranian armed forces during the anti-Shah resistance, within Filipino armed forces during the anti-Marcos uprising, and within the Israeli military during the first Palestinian Intifada, and over the course of the Indonesian military campaign in East Timor, just to take a few examples. Fighting an armed actor is likewise costly, but it is less likely to create as much introspection among the commanding officers, who might instead feel physically threatened by the violence and view the violent insurgents as minorities within the population resorting to violence out of desperation or out of a desire to inflict punishment. Regime functionaries are also less likely to see violent protesters as potential bargaining partners than nonviolent groups. As the number of participants in violent insurgency increases, we see no real gains in the probability of security force defections. Instead, faced with a violent insurgency, security forces are likelier to unify behind the regime as the fight becomes a defensive contest of brute force. Under such conditions, security forces may even become more loyal to the regime, or the regime may simply purge any ambivalent troops. Resistance of any kind against most of these regimes is met with repression almost all of the time. In fact, in our data set, over 88% of all campaigns were met with violent resistance by their adversaries. However, it may be easier for states to justify violent crackdowns and draconian measures to domestic and international audiences when they're challenged by an armed insurgency. On the other hand, converting, co-opting, or successfully appealing to the interests of those targeted with violence is more difficult because, as discussed above, regime members and security forces are more likely to think defensively in the face of the violent threat. In fact, repression is not as devastating to nonviolent campaigns as it is to violent ones. In all of the cases where government repression occurred, violent campaigns were less than 20% likely to succeed, whereas nonviolent campaigns are more than 60% likely to succeed. This trend suggests that nonviolent campaigns are often able to adapt to and outmaneuver even the most repressive adversaries. This is a counterintuitive finding because it's often assumed that violent repression weakens nonviolent campaigns relative to violent ones. The state cannot indefinitely repress all of the people, particularly when numbers are increasing. This dynamic could be seen in the 1986 People Power Revolution against Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, where armed challengers to the dictatorship invited harsh regime reprisals without attracting mass support or threatening the regime's grip on power. The regime's oppression against the unarmed campaign, though, generated outrage among both domestic and international constituents, leading to even more broad-based multi-sectoral mobilization against the Marcos regime. State sponsors may give direct aid to resistance campaigns, depending upon the political context and domestic conditions. Specifically, foreign states may sometimes contribute arms or financial assistance to a foreign insurgency when the two share mutual interests. For instance, Pakistan and the United States supported the anti-Soviet insurgency in Afghanistan during the 1980s because both countries wished to see the end of the Soviet occupation there. The United States was also alleged to have contributed several $million to the anti-Milosevic nonviolent campaign in Serbia in the late 1990s. But we find that foreign governments are likelier to lend material support to violent resistance campaigns, whom the states often see as their proxies, and they're much more likely to do this than directly support nonviolent campaigns. Whereas about a third of the violent insurgencies in our data set received material support from a foreign state, less than 10% of nonviolent campaigns did. The aid of an external donor may help violent insurgencies to wage successful campaigns against more powerful adversaries. Many would argue, for example, that Franco's revolutionary fascists would have been defeated by the Spanish Republicans without the support of Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. In fact, state support increases the chances of success for violent campaigns to about 40%, well over the mean for violent insurgencies. But state support is much less reliable than domestic sources of power. States are fickle, as the Palestine Liberation Organization learned when Jordan expelled it in 1970. States are also known to attach many conditions to their aid, greatly complicating the strategic maneuverability of different actors. While nonviolent campaigns do not typically receive state support, when they do, it doesn't appear to have much effect on the outcome of the campaign. Although it may be more useful in some cases than in others, nonviolent campaigns seem to be better off without state sponsors. Our results suggest that domestic mechanisms, particularly domestic mobilization and the ability to induce security force defections, are the most critical components of the success of resistance campaigns. Both of these conditions are likelier to be produced by nonviolent campaigns than violent ones. While foreign support may have been critical in some cases, there's no general pattern indicating that they are necessary for success. Regime crackdowns often induce backfire and are therefore not necessarily determinants of campaign failure. For violent campaigns, which find it much more difficult to produce security force defections or attract high numbers of participants, the presence of a foreign state sponsor is the main determinant of success. Foreign state sponsorship increases the likelihood of success by over 15%, but as I mentioned, state sponsors are unreliable at best and antagonistic at worst. It's important to note that there are some important deviations from our assumption that violent campaigns only attract limited numbers of participants. The Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Algerian Revolution, Cuban Revolution, Vietnam War, and Afghan anti-Soviet insurgency come to mind as major examples of violent insurgencies that did bring about revolutionary change, often with large numbers of participants. Such cases are key outliers to the argument that nonviolent campaigns are likelier than violent campaigns to succeed. But upon examining these cases, it is clear that many of the features common to successful nonviolent campaigns occurred in these revolutions, especially diverse mass mobilization, which led to loyalty shifts within the ruling regime's economic and military elites, and external support from state sponsors. These and other successful armed campaigns typically succeed in building a strong base of popular support while creating parallel administrative, political, social, and economic structures. We do not dispute, therefore, that violent insurgencies sometimes succeed. In fact, about 25% of the cases in my data set did succeed. But one must consider the consequences of such victories. Although violent insurgencies captured power or expelled foreign occupations in these cases, the human costs have been very high, with millions of casualties across these cases. Moreover, the conditions in these countries after the conflict ended have been overwhelmingly more repressive than in transitions driven by nonviolent civic pressure. In all 5 cases above, the new regimes featuring the victorious insurgents were very harsh towards civilian populations after the dust settled. None of these countries could be classified today as democratic. Looking at the numbers, countries in which nonviolent campaigns have existed, not just succeeded, but only existed, are more likely to be democracies 5 years after the end of the conflict than are countries in which violent campaigns have existed. In fact, they're 37% more likely to be democracies 5 years after the conflict ends. This figure is even more striking in extant democracies. In countries that were democracies during the conflicts themselves, only 15% are likely to remain democracies after the end of a violent insurgency. On the other hand, 84% are likely to remain democracies after the end of a nonviolent campaign. The figures are similar with respect to civil peace. Countries that have experienced a violent insurgency are 43% likely to experience a relapse into civil war within 5 years of the end of the conflict. Countries that have experienced a nonviolent campaign, on the other hand, are 15% less likely to experience a civil war within 5 years of the end of the campaign. So although violent insurgencies sometimes succeed, they tend to reproduce the martial values and violent institutions that brought them to prominence. The long-term consequences of violent insurgencies make for more repression and more violence in the vast majority of these countries. Before I conclude my prepared remarks, I want to identify what I think are the core weaknesses of this study. First, it considers only ideal types of nonviolent and violent campaigns and of two broad categories of goals, regime change and territorial goals. Second, the unit of analysis is over-aggregated, so I can't measure the effects of different tactical choices, and I can't measure the effects of non-events, that is, a refusal to adopt certain tactics. This over-aggregation fails to capture the iterative nature of the conflict, intergroup and campaign versus state interactions over time. Moreover, the statistics I presented show only correlation, not causation. To resolve these shortcomings, I've launched the next iteration of this project, in which my research team is collecting annual data on campaigns from 1900 to 2006, and monthly group-level data on campaigns from 1989 to 2009 using textual analysis by augmented replacement instructions, or TABARI. This software program allows researchers to collect daily events data for each campaign using machine coding techniques. The software reads lead sentences of open source news reports and transforms them into data observations. This method helps me to change the level of analysis from the campaign to the monthly, weekly, or daily interaction between the state and the group, as well as collecting more specific data on the types of tactics each group uses in a month, such as a strike, sit-in, bombing, or kidnapping. With the resultant data, we will be able to get at the tactical level of analysis, account for non-events, explore the state-opponent interactions more carefully, and unpack some of the complexities within the conflicts. The new study will also include many other variables, especially intra-organizational variables. But in the meantime, the study that Maria and I have concluded allows us to make some claims about the relative utility of nonviolent versus violent campaigns, at least from this more macro perspective. First, nonviolent resistance is surprisingly effective relative to its violent counterparts, and this trend is increasingly visible. These findings encourage us to recognize non-military sources of power, and they downplay violent insurgency as more disruptive than powerful. Second, the claim that insurgents use violence because violence is necessary is often quite wrong. This begs the question, if violent insurgency is so ineffective, then why does it happen so often? This question is studied extensively elsewhere and is beyond the scope of tonight's talk, but I think we're going to be talking about it all weekend. So I hope you'll join us for that. But I think our critique of the conventional wisdom also points to another set of issues, which reminds me of my own skepticism before I began this research. I found myself thinking, why is it more comforting to believe that violence works? And why do we find it appealing, despite ample evidence to the contrary, to say that violence happens because of circumstances or because of necessity, that it's the only way out of some situations? The evidence I have presented today suggests that opposition violence is probably not usually justified by circumstances, as a last resort, or by necessity. To the extent that we perpetuate that conventional wisdom, do we permit its abuse? Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Erica. And what we're going to do is we're going to hold questions until after our next speaker. So, and that is Julie Mertus. Okay. Now, I would like to introduce Professor Julie Mertus. When we were researching speakers for this year's World Affairs Forum, I was struck by how Julie Mertus was exactly the kind of scholar activist that we were looking for. And you'll see that the other four, because you've met Erica, participants in this seminar also have a combination of activism and scholarly research. Currently, Julie is the co-director of the Ethics, Peace, and Global Affairs program at American University, where she has taught for the last 10 years. After graduating from Yale Law School, Julie began her engagement in human rights issues. She worked for the ACLU's Reproductive Rights Project. Then she went on to work in the Balkans for Human Rights Watch to research the impact of the Balkan War on women, specifically regarding sexual violence and rape. There she interviewed survivors and witnesses of ethnic violence as the first steps towards creating a wartime tribunal. From these experiences, she wrote a book entitled Kosovo, How Myths and Truth Started a War. She's written a more recent book entitled Bait and Switch, Human Rights and U.S. Foreign Policy, that was named the Human Rights Book of the Year by the American Political Science Association. Julie has received many other awards, including American University School of International Service Outstanding Teacher Scholar Award. She was a Fulbright Scholar twice, once in Romania and then in Denmark, and she was a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and a human rights fellow at Harvard Law School. Julie has been engaged in fostering the human rights of refugees, especially women from the Balkans. Julie told me, and it seems like a minor part of her biography, but I was really captured by it, that she accompanied Eve Ensler. If you remember who Eve Ensler is, the playwright and author of the Vagina Monologues, to Pakistan to witness and address the plight of Bosnian women refugees who were essentially stuck without adequate resources in a land and culture totally foreign to them. And Julie was so moved that she wrote an op-ed piece for the Washington Post about their plight. And within weeks, these women were released and resettled, often in the United States. As an engaged scholar with a sense of deep compassion for those disinherited by ethnic strife and war, Julie has demonstrated that she, as a professor of ethics, is engaged in the practice of what she teaches. I'm very pleased to welcome Julie Mertus.
Wow, there are a lot of people at Juneau here tonight. Thank you for that, Elaine and Bob, and thank you for housing me, and thank you to the advisors of this. When my son was about 4 years old, we went on a hike. We always go hiking in the summer. And we went a little ways, and he said to me, "Mama, I forgot. Why do we do this?" And I said, "Cool drums." And I said, "Oh, we do it because it's beautiful and because it's fun." Oh, now I remembered. You know, and I'm so happy that you're here because hopefully it'll be fun, and hopefully I'll not teach you, but I'll give you some information that you might not have, and we'll consider big issues and little issues together throughout the weekend. So thank you very much for making this great event. I'm a human rights person, and I'm identified as a human rights advocate. I really, really, really believe in human rights. Now, when I was in law school, I was much more cynical. It was a thing to do, to doubt everything. But that was before I went to refugee camps around the world and spent time with people who had no rights. When you don't have any rights, you want them. That was before I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. That was before I became a mother. That was before I buried a father much too soon because of poor health care. I used to be much more cynical about human rights, but now human rights issues are not so abstract. I'm going to take you on a little tour of human rights. We'll call it the Julie Mertus tour. And I believe that human rights is a revolutionary force. And do you know who said that human rights is revolution? Malcolm X. And a lot of people think human rights, boy, that's not very revolutionary at all. But it was revolutionary. The modern human rights movement is born of two revolutions, the French and the American. In both cases, individuals who had never fought back, these are individuals who had never fought back, were called upon to rebel against authority. The idea and practice of human rights proved to be both an instigator and sustainer of revolution, and a source for radicalization of social change campaigns. The insertion of human rights into patterns of human interaction opened space for new actors working across what were boundaries with different needs, interests, and demands. In creating new patterns of human government and interaction, revolutionaries seized upon the human rights scriptures in crafting their demands for structural change. Now, the logic of human rights is that human rights are something people have because they're human. So the state cannot act like they're privileges. The state cannot grant, this is what Malcolm X was talking about. The state cannot grant human rights, and they cannot take them away. Also, because human rights are something people have because they're human, they're universal. This doesn't mean they're the same for everyone in every context. Rights cannot be understood outside of their particular political and social context. But believing in human rights means believing in the equal moral worth of human beings, of the equal, my worth and your worth as a human being is equal. For human rights to stick required a major shift in how individuals perceived their place in the world. As Lynn Hunt observed in her brilliant book, Inventing Human Rights, this is a quote, "Thinking and deciding for oneself requires psychological and political changes as much as philosophical ones." Now, the political changes necessary for human rights have been discussed. States cannot do what they want to their own citizens. States act as duty bearers. So that's duty bearers. It sounds like bears, like you're afraid of them in the woods. But states are duty bearers and people are rights holders. Now, the exact contour of the relationship is contested. With little doubt, states have a negative responsibility to refrain from doing certain things. Under human rights, states have a negative responsibility. They can't interfere in one's choice of religion, ability to speak, privacy in one's home, et cetera, et cetera. And they also should be said to have a positive responsibility with regard to certain issues like health care, decent and adequate health care, housing, decent and adequate housing, and employment. Of course, there is a politics to this. I just wrote something called Human Rights Politics. And there is a politics, but there's also a psychology to it. And maybe because I've been staying with Elaine, I thought that I've been thinking more about the psychology of it. The psychological aspects of individual acceptance for human rights are not usually discussed. But prior to the acceptance of human rights on the big stage of life, people had to be convinced that they were worthy as individuals. People were born into a set of circumstances that determined their degree of freedom. In medieval times, you were owned by your lord, your king, your master. In sharp contrast, human rights demands that individuals take initiative in crafting an identity of their own choosing. When people were owned or controlled by their master, their lord, their ruler, they did not have an independent identity. They were identified not as an individual with dreams and desires of their own, but by their position in society. They're born into the position in society. This is what I love about human rights. The logic of human rights blasts these notions wide open by turning all individuals from being an object in someone else's life to being a subject in your own life. Agency, bodily integrity, empathy, dignity, all concepts encouraged by human rights. I'll take an illustration. It seems like for a good time in Juneau, you come here. But say there was a town square. So what's like a town square? White Marina or White? Marine Park. People would go to Marine Park to watch somebody be tortured. And they would cheer as a man was lifted and put in the device that stretched him until his bones cracked. And they would clap as the women were thrown into the well with stones in bags tied to their feet. And if they didn't come up, they weren't witches, but if they managed to come up, they definitely were. And people would cheer at the man nailed to the cross and put on display. Today, although torture certainly does occur, it's done clandestinely. At least we publicly condemn it. We're not into cheering on the torture anymore. Why? What has happened to us? I would suggest that we want to see ourselves on the side of human rights. Torture cannot be tolerated under a human rights framework. Not sometimes, never, ever, 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 torture cannot be counted on. Because human rights presumes individuals' rights to separateness and to bodily integrity. We no longer think of ourselves as subjects of the king, who at any time could become the next source of gross amusement in the marketplace. No, we've progressed beyond that time. Psychologically, we think we're worth it. We have moral worth. We are human rights people. I told you this was a tour. So flash forward to World War II and the creation of the United Nations. The US was called upon to show just what kind of a human rights person it would be. Would it be for human rights for all people, or just some rights and some people? Timothy Tyson, does anybody know Timothy Tyson? Somebody I really want to get to know, because he wrote this great book called The Roots of the Black Power Movement in Radio Free Dixie. And what he said is that World War II gave African Americans unprecedented power to redeem or repudiate American democracy in the eyes of the world. In particular, the debates over human rights provisions for the UN Charter gave African Americans a powerful podium from which to address race issues. There's another good book that I would recommend called Eyes Off the Prize, Eyes Off the Prize by Carol Anderson. And she wrote the following: civil rights, which we're supposed to have in the US, can only speak to overt political and legal discrimination. Human rights, on the other hand, especially as articulated by the United Nations and influenced by the moral shock of the Holocaust, had the language and the philosophical power to address not only political and legal inequities, but also education, healthcare, housing, so that both political rights and economic rights. U.S. anti-racism advocates at the UN knew that all this talk about economic rights was just quicksand, unless the U.S. really supported it. But in the mid and late 1940s, any group fighting for economic rights faced a real problem. What did they face? Being labeled a communist. So if you push too hard as a group for economic rights, you must be a communist traitor and shut down. And the NAACP was really afraid of this because they didn't want to be shut down. So they kind of eased up on their demand for economic rights. Supporting anti-colonialist efforts also proved untenable for the US delegation for other reasons. There was a group of highly organized Nigerian students who kept on meeting individually, and they were told that the word independence, freedom, and anti-colonialism, those words, freedom and anti-colonialism, would somehow make it into the final document. It was a lie. It wasn't made into the final document. Why? There were other things going on in the world. Washington and Moscow were looking at each other a little tentatively, And the U.S. did not want to lose any support of any of its allies, especially places that had planes that could go quickly over to Moscow and the Soviet sphere. So a deal was struck between the U.S. and colonial nations. And that is that the U.S. would support a provision that for years would serve to block any real progress on human rights. And it's this little phrase: nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. I'll read it again, it's worth it. Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. This provision kept racists in America happy. They read it as complementary to their states' rights movement in the US. Wearing federalism as a shield against human rights demands, the American delegation at the last moment rejected everything the NAACP wanted. And do you know who was the biggest sellout for the NAACP? Eleanor Roosevelt. Yes, she was on the board of the NAACP, but she was taking her marching orders from Washington, and they said, no, you know, we can't risk it. And so the NAACP in 1947 filed its own petition with the UN, wanting to draw attention to all forms of racism in the US. And the petition caused a huge sensation. The editorial page of an African-American newspaper at the time declared, finally, we are beginning to see that America can be answerable to the family of nations for its injustices to the Negro minority. But Eleanor Roosevelt did what she could to not only did she accept that nothing in the present charter, but she also blocked a complaint to the UN concerning race discrimination in South Africa. So this would have been big, you know, it'd be mid-40s to have a resolution dealing with South Africa. Her justification for blocking it, the old slippery slope argument, before you know it, there'll be blue helmets in Alabama telling people what to do. And so she sold out there as well. Don't get it wrong, I like her. How could you not like her? But I think I'm going to write a book about her and get to know her a little bit more. Over the next 62 years, the performance of the U.S. in these negotiations in San Francisco set the stage for America's fear of engagement with human rights. Human rights from the very beginning, because I've shown this through these examples, has been absolutely there in U.S. foreign policy. It's been there in U.S. foreign policy, but the U.S. doesn't want to recognize it. Okay, well, there's a little game here. I'm going to give you a quote, and you tell me who said it. We cannot escape the fact that our civil rights record has become an issue in world politics. 1947. Who do you think said it? You're right. Excellent. Harry Truman said it. He was, you know, remember him? And this one's even better. They get better as they go along. There's only 3. Racial discrimination in the United States remains a constant source of embarrassment to the government in the day-to-day conduct of its foreign relations. 1952. It was the Secretary, this is harder, Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. Okay, this one I think you can get, because this is a real supporter of human rights. See, everyone sees it, everyone. It's not a Republican-Democrat issue. Human rights is in U.S. foreign policy. That's the way it is. And if you don't deal with it, you'll be embarrassed or worse. Every act of discrimination or prejudice in the U.S. hurts America as much as an espionage agent who turns over weapons to a foreign country. Do, 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 do. What year? It's 1954. Vice President Nixon. And a supporter of human rights there. So, for 62 years, the U.S.'s policy has been this. Number one, in standard setting. Standard setting is like naming of rights. Focus on formal civil and political rights, and do your best to exclude the issue of race as much as possible. And number two, in institution building and enforcement, create weak enforcement mechanisms so they look like they're working, but they're not, especially with regard to race. With regard to American exceptionalism, this is the feeling that America is the anointed city on the hill type of thing. To the greatest extent possible, keep thinking that human rights are for some other place, not for here. There's something that happens over there. But we see that it's not something that happens over there. I just took you on a tour of human rights. We began in medieval times when human rights ideas took root only after political changes were accompanied by psychological changes. We are no longer accepting to be subjects of the king. We are all human beings. We are all human beings, and we all deserve to be treated as if we have equal moral worth. We flash forward to World War II, and we learn that from the very beginning, human rights were a huge factor in U.S. foreign policy, although we continue to pretend that it is not. This is a great conference because these questions there are a lot of questions that are open, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our speakers, and we're open for questions and discussion. We've got some time for that. In the front row.
Thank you. Erica, this is for Erica. Assuming that the information I've heard is true, that the majority of Afghan citizens want the U.S. out, if you went in to advise them how to get us out, how to get the U.S. out of Afghanistan, what would you tell them?
Oh, right, of course. Great.
Glad you asked that question.
All right, we're in good shape. So you're not the first person who's asked me how to expel a foreign occupation or overthrow a nasty regime. And you know, as I said, the you know, every context is completely different, and every resistance movement has to adopt a set of tactics and strategies that make sense in terms of their own environments. And essentially, the campaigns that have worked have succeeded in dividing the opponents so that maintaining a presence in, you know, a foreign place just became too costly. And it doesn't have to happen with violence, you know. In fact, it happens quicker with nonviolent resistance. So I would obviously encourage them to stop using violence as a number one change in their strategic approach. You know, insurgencies, nonviolent movements that have succeeded in the past will often do things like use economic boycotts. And it's very difficult to do that when you're in a situation where there's no economic dependence, you know, where, you know, it's not like if they'd stop buying our goods, we're in big trouble or something, you know. So it's more just mass acts of disobedience, you know, and you know, in the Algerian context, the way that looked was, you know, they did have strikes and boycotts and this sort of thing, the French public became intolerant of the occupation. In fact, it brought down the regime, and they actually had to install a new French government as a result of the fact that not only did the French public become fed up with the occupation, but they weren't willing to tolerate the types of actions that were required to keep putting it down, like torture and repression. And I actually think that's happening here already. So anyway, I always get myself into trouble with this because I don't want to tell anybody how to, defeat the United States or something. But
They don't like that.
yeah. But as I said, every context is different. So they have to choose tactics that make sense in light of their own circumstances. Just have to repeat the question.
Odd enough, but I think we're being recorded too.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thank you so much for speaking. I was an international relations major in college, and I've just been waiting for an opportunity to nerd out on international relations. So when I saw that this was being hosted, I was like, yes. So thank you to everybody who put this together. I had a question for you, Erica. I read a little bit about nonviolent struggles, and of course, this is a long time ago in high school debate when I was nerding out on debate previously. And one of the kind of things that was reported about nonviolent struggles and how effective they are was if nonviolent struggles back up their nonviolence tactics with threats of violence, then they're basically unsuccessful, or as unsuccessful, maybe according to your research, to violent struggles. And I didn't know if maybe you've come across that and what you think of that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that often comes up is, do these campaigns succeed because there's an implicit threat of violence behind them? Are they succeeding short of violence? Would they eventually adopt violence if the nonviolent action didn't work? And are the regimes really afraid because they see this mass of people and think we're going to be in trouble if they all pick up guns? I've studied it and I've tested it, and the finding is that even when the campaigns do try to adopt what we would call a radical flank, it has no effect on the outcome at all. It's not statistically significant, meaning that it has, it doesn't predict success or failure at all. And I would say actually that it's more risky as a tactic. It might have a negative effect on your success because the key mechanism of change is this security force defection. And the key reason they defect is because they don't feel personally, physically threatened by the campaign. So if you're going to adopt a radical flank, you're running a risk of alienating that part of the population that might either be willing to join the campaign or would be willing to convert in the regime. I'm working on a study right now with a sociologist about the radical flank effect with some of this data, and I can send you some information if you're interested. You can just come and give me your information.
Is that on? Okay. Yeah, I have a question for Julie. Based on your studies and your research and your world travels, whatever, do you feel that we as a species, given the changing nature of violence and the depersonalization, often with using machines compared to the Middle Ages where it was more hand-to-hand, proportionately to the number of human beings that are on the planet now, or whatever, do you feel that we're making progress as a species in the pursuit of developing a more peaceful nature or a more tolerant way of being with each other on the planet? Is there hope?
Oh, there's got to be hope. I mean, what do you do if there's no hope? But you're right. Wars have changed. There's more wars that are within states instead of between states. There's more civilian casualties, more wars that are about moving people, and more acts of the soldiers that are questionable. There's more flying high. so that you don't get hit, but then there's more collateral damage. If you want, you can make a parade of horribles about bad new developments. But I don't know. I always try to find the glass being more than half full. I mean, we're here, right? We're talking to each other. We're nerding out on a. I love that nerding out. Yeah, and it is. It's fun, isn't it? It's hip to nerd out. But that we're here and we're talking about these things. That's where I find the hope. You can come in as well. That's right.
Thank you. Julie, I think you said human rights proceeds from human worth, which is sort of an economics concept. Supply and demand, what's a human worth? So consider trends. There are 6 billion of us. We're headed for 9 billion. And the other trends in the life support system on which we all depend seem to be all going in the wrong way. So are we going to see a diminution of the value, the worth of a human, and therefore less attention to human rights as a result of these trends?
Well, I think that's a very clever way of looking at worth. I was using the ethics definition of worth, and the major question in ethics is, how shall we live? How do you want to live? And so that's what I would say in answer to your question. And I want to live in a place where people are treated as if they're equal. They don't have to earn their worth. They don't have to be. That's why I used worth, but I didn't mean it in a measurement kind of way.
Thank both of you very much. I'm a pediatrician, and I continue to be very worried about how human history really devalues most children. I want to ask both of you this question. It's an oversimplification, but if you had to pick between whether corporate economic control or hatred of women or misogyny is more the cause of lack of successful in peace, which would you pick and how would you rank them?
I don't think I would ask that question. But do you know how to respond?
Passing the buck.
I'm assuming you're going to be objective despite your gender.
Yeah. So I guess if I just want to make sure I have your question right. You're saying as a cause of conflict, violent conflict, I assume, is it, if we had to pick between the two, whether it's repression of women versus economic greed, you might say?
Economic control and repression, yes.
Okay, or exploitation maybe. Which would it be of those two? Which is more important? I'm not sure either of those is the main cause, but if I had to rank them, I would say the economic is probably more, I think that over the history of humankind, you can buy people off. We're trying to buy off the Taliban right now, and with certain elements of it, it's working. And so people's economic grievances, if you can satisfy them, they might change their behavior. And they might even change their behavior to stop being mean to women, So I guess that's probably, in the hierarchy of interests, that would be the higher than anti-female stuff, but I think that it could be different in different contexts as well. You might have the reverse in certain cases.
Well, you began your remarks by telling us that you're concerned about children, and I think that that's something that we hadn't mentioned, and it's good that you focused us on that, because children have human rights too, and that's another area that's of great concern with the U.S. not wanting to take part in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child because we're worried about parents losing their rights to raise their kids in the way they want to raise them, to spank them or whatever. But that's of course not true. That's not what the convention's about. But thank you for focusing us on that issue of children.
Thank you. Erica, could you comment a little bit about Burma? Is there hope and sort of talk a little bit about what's stopping that from going anywhere?
So my co-author is the one who's been to places talking to the people, and so I have a very rudimentary understanding, but here's what I know. I think that part of the problem with the conflict in Burma is that the pro-democracy movement has been really unified around a single figure, Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been under house arrest now for going on 20 years. And so if you put all your eggs in one basket, and they, a crude term we use is decapitation, which is that you remove the sort of head of the pyramid of that movement, and there's nobody to replace them, or nobody, the movement is completely dispersed as soon as that person's removed from the scene. You really can't adopt the discipline that's necessary to maintain nonviolent resistance. In fact, much of the movement has gone into the jungles and joined the Maoist insurgencies and the ethnic insurgencies. And so the movement has essentially been very disunified since essentially the early 1990s. And there is nonviolent resistance there, but it's not anywhere close to what it was in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's largely because their source of power has been taken out of the picture.
This on? Oh, okay. I'm kind of an international relations geek too, so this is kind of exciting for me. Thank you for coming to talk to us. I've heard a lot of speakers kind of like you before, the people that talk about human rights and who really know their stuff. And something I try to ask every time I hear speakers like you is, what can people do? I mean, what can the average person do to, I guess, like you were saying, Erica, there's such a big difference between nonviolent and violent campaigns. Well, what can people do to make a change? What can people do?
You want me to start first, and then I'll give it to Julie?
Yeah.
Okay. I really do think there's this conventional wisdom or this conventional understanding that violence works, and this notion that, if they're using violence, insurgents say, it's because they have to, because they're driven to, because of their circumstances, or, we're doing something to them that's causing them to have to use violence. And I'm very dubious of these types of claims. And so my hope is that people start to challenge that, And so what I tell my students is, when you're having a conversation over coffee and somebody says something like that, you can correct them and have an interesting conversation. And just challenge that conventional wisdom is what I'd say is most useful. And for the other people that are in contexts where they actually want to overthrow a regime, I can hook you up with an NGO that teaches people how to use nonviolent methods, but that's not my skill set at all.
Yeah, Amnesty International has always had letter writing campaigns and things like that, and sometimes people think, oh, that never works. I was wandering around Kosovo a couple years ago, and somebody came and gave me a big cake. It was like a pie type of cake, and I said, well, what's this for? And she said, oh, you got my husband out of jail. And word had it, and that doesn't usually happen, because they don't find you. But Kosovo is a small place, and they found me, and so what's my point? Two things. One is that there are some direct letter writing campaigns, and the letters do matter, and pushing politicians in a certain direction does matter. The other thing is you can work on bringing human rights to your everyday life. And when I first joined the Peace Studies Department at American University, I wasn't ready, because I would say things like, "Oh, that we killed 2 birds with 1 stone," and the head of my department would say, "Julie, did we feed 2 birds with 1 hand? And do you want me to put bullets in this memo?" Yeah, because we're so militarized. Everything is military. And so you can think about that in your own life, how you can demilitarize.
Well, first, Julie, I'd like to say thank you for all the work you said you did in the Balkans, and because that war is very personal to me and to my family, so that's good to hear. And a question for both of you, actually, because I can't speak for everyone in the room, but most of the clothing in my closet was sewn by children who have their rights as humans violated on a daily basis. And I guess as citizens of the United States, we're a really good example. Maybe we could be in the future for an economic protest, or all the methods you were talking about. We can't really engage in violent, I couldn't see that working out, violent resistance to our economic system, which exploits people. So how would you feel about that? What do you think maybe we should do? Or it's a pretty big, nasty...
Yeah, be creative. Think about what you want to do. I mean, if you wanted to go around to stores and put seals of approval on certain soccer balls and not on the other soccer balls, you could undertake that. There's a lot of things that you could do. There are a lot of curriculums on children and the marketplace, and if you wanted to, you could maybe go to the elementary school and get a teacher to let you teach a class, have an hour with the kids. They'll get a break. They'll feel good. But there's a lot of good curriculum on that.
Yeah, and I guess once you figure out what a useful tactic would be, whether it's boycotting a particular product or a particular company, or signaling your support for one or the other, the key problem is coordinating enough people so that it makes a difference. And I guess that's sort of the political problem. And so information is very important, and the internet makes it very easy to do things on Facebook or on email campaigns and that sort of thing, forwarding. And there's a lot of research actually about which types of telecommunications campaigns work, and gathering people around certain campaigns. So anyway. Yeah, so her question was, have studies shown whether social networking sites tend to be the best? And yeah, I mean, they can be very powerful. There's no mistake, in the Chinese government shutting down Facebook, and people using texting. In China, that's one way they circumvent the problem of lack of access to social networking. Is they'll text each other with codes like, "We're all going for a walk now," and then there's 30,000 people going for a walk down the street. So it makes it pretty easy to coordinate those types of campaigns.
I teach a class on human rights in media, and the entire syllabus has changed 100%, because we spend now a lot of time on new communication technologies and the relationship to human rights as far as capturing human rights abuses, organizing protests, and dodging police, the works. I also teach a distance learning class on human rights in U.S. foreign policy. And I didn't want to put a plug in for it, but I thought I would.
Yes. First of all, great presentations by both of you, so thank you.
Erica, I was in Palestine this summer and did quite a bit of speaking with and visiting to members of the nonviolent movement that is burgeoning there. You may know that. And I'm kind of, this is maybe more of a comment than a question, because I don't know if people are really aware of the tremendously hopeful things that are happening in the West Bank. I wish I could say Gaza was a part of that. But the things that impressed me about it the most, and I've been in the region, I lived there in the early 80s, and I've gone back and forth over the years, and I've seen nothing quite like what is happening now. And it seems to me that a number of things have changed. First of all, there is a maturity in the leadership, and I'm talking about civil society leadership. And actually, I think they're having an impact on PLO leadership too, so that's a very interesting part of the process. And also, they have alliances for more Israeli activists now willing to cross the green line and actually be putting their bodies on the line in civil disobedience, et cetera. So I'm putting it out there and just curious to know what the buzz in your circles are and what you might be thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, the buzz is that the Palestinian nonviolent resistance is alive and well and on the move. My co-author and she's now at the State Department, but her previous organization that she worked for was, they actually did some trainings of nonviolent activists, and I think continue to. And, you know, the women's movement there is instrumental in unifying that movement. And, you know, I think the problem is that we do these surveys, you know, where we ask people, do you support, you know, nonviolent resistance? Do you support violent insurgency? And, you know, one of my colleagues was really excited because they found in one of these surveys that 90% of Palestinians supported nonviolent resistance. And they were really excited. And then they read down the page and it said 90% also support violent resistance. So, you know, they support resistance, you know? And so the question is, how can you convince them that the most effective type is going to be nonviolent? And that's a huge task, but I think that, you know, there is more support for that these days.
When I was there, some of the leaders that I met with were convening a meeting with 270 village leaders from throughout the West Bank to be discussing nonviolent tactics. So it feels like a glimmer of hope to me.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, if they could reproduce the economic boycotts they had during the first Intifada, and they could also reproduce the Israeli security force defections that occurred during the first Intifada, I mean, that's basically the whole deal right there. If they can get a sizable portion of the Israeli military to refuse to serve based on the illegality of the occupation, then that would really open up bargaining space for them.
Thank you. Thank you very much for both of your talks. I would like to ask if you could speak to the experience that I've had in going to Mexico and being a volunteer in places where there is violence, and just demonstrating by our willingness to be there and to help and share our knowledge of what it's like to be good to women and good to children, just by our presence and the work that we do there, how that is a force in nonviolent resistance to customary and traditional violent mentality.
What kind of work exactly? I don't understand.
I've been a volunteer for 15 years at a large orphanage in Mexico, in Querétaro, and working with the parents of the children that come to the orphanage and the school. In a lot of the problems in the poor Mexican communities, rural communities, are the same as here in Alaska. And I think that I've seen a change in supporting nonviolence by being there and having other people come for just 2 weeks to volunteer and having their lives changed. I think it's just a wonderful way to approach an awareness of international issues in nonviolence.
Well, I applaud you and for doing that every summer, and I think that part of your point was, and you do it in a way that other people see that you are nonviolent and dedicated, and this must be awfully emotional and tough work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if there's any lesson that comes out of the research that I talked about, it's that there are really important demonstration effects. You know, if it works somewhere and people see that, then they try to replicate what works. And we just absolutely know that from all kinds of different research. So, yeah.
Yeah. People are starting to leave, so I feel like we should talk about tomorrow's before people go away.
I was just about to butt in there and say, I'll say my thing, and then we'll have time for one more question. But tomorrow we'll be getting back together at 10 in the morning in the same room, and our program will go from 10 to 5 with a lunch break for an hour or so. And we'll have interesting speakers on tomorrow, as well as panel discussions, including the speakers who are on tonight. Tomorrow evening, again, there's a participatory workshop from 7 to 8:30, and we'll also be continuing the forum on Sunday from 10 to 5. And now, if anyone has a last pressing question, why were you waiting to be last?
Thanks. Do you see any correlation between the percentage of women as leaders and the standard of human rights, or the less violent behavior in states?
I have not seen it. Oh, yeah, it's on. So you can think about, you know, sort of the Indira Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto. I mean, those are situations where, you know, their violent conflicts persisted and perhaps increased. Benazir Bhutto, you know, I mean, so there are lots of problems even when you have female heads of state in some places. I'd like to think so, but I just don't see the evidence.
Well, no, I understand what's underneath your question, but I just say there are plenty of mean women and nice men. Not in Alaska?
No, we've seen there.
Yeah. Well, I'm not mentioning.
Well, I guess we could close on that. That vote for female equality. Well, let's give our speakers a big hand. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow and the next day.